All right, everybody. Time to move on the main card, and we get into a high-profile flyweight contest between two men ranked in the top 15 of the both the meta and the media updated rankings, and we're going to go through those after we look at the tail of the tape between Charles Energy Johnson and Azu Almabayev. All right, so Azu Almabayev has 26 professional fights to his opponent's 27, very even as far as experience goes. 23 and 3 record for Almabayev and 19 and 8 for Charles Energy Johnson. He has a 5-inch height advantage. He has a 5-inch reach advantage. He's 3 years older, and he has a switch stance to his opponent's orthodox. He is a very well-rounded mixed martial artist, has knockouts and submissions, just like his opponent in Almabayev. But let's look mostly at these opponents as we look at man who I think deserves more praise because I guess his ranking is higher. Well, let's see. So when we look at the rankings, this is the updated media rankings, right? Charles Johnson is number 14, and Azu Almabayev is number 9, ranked below Brandon Moreno, like he should be. But in the new updated media rankings, he is number 7, and Charles Johnson is punished more, and he is number 15. I'm going to go through when I break down Charles Johnson's career. You're going to be like, how is that possible? Well, let's look at it, shall we? First thing, we'll look at the number 9, but technically meta ranked number 7, ranked flyweight in the world, Azu Almabayev. So this man trains at DAR or Darpar MMA team, where he has, some Sanam. Like he is one of the biggest Kazakhstan gyms in the world, and that's why this has, very much, it's a Kazakhstan, regional gym that has, all the best regional fighters coming up to try and make their run into the UFC like Almabayev is doing. But let's see what he's done so far. 6-1, 7 fights in the UFC, 1 loss. And then we look at who his win losses to. We'll get to that very shortly. But yep, that's nothing but green, green, green in his way coming into the UFC before he got into the promotion. And then so far, it's been almost everything perfect except 1 loss in his last 11 bouts. All right, so let's look at his experience before he came to UFC. He was a Brave FC alum, fighting former UFC flyweight alum, and I believe he was ranked at one time too, Zach Makovsky. He beat him by a controversial split decision, but still, the decision went to Almabayev, and he gets to take that into his record. So then he would take on Kenneth Manigant, and he would beat him by a second round rear naked choke and continuing his momentum. And that's how the two-time Brave FC winner was ready to emerge as a contender into the world's most prominent promotion, the UFC. And this man got an opportunity to make his debut against O'Day Osborne, and he took this win and he got the victory. He submitted O'Day Osborne with a rear naked choke, and then he continued that to take on a Dana White Contender Series alum, CJ Vergara, which, man, you look at the guys that he had to face, it's not even fair. On top of that, facing a top 10 in the making, Azu Almabayev, lose this fight. And then it was a decision. So then we get to his third fight in the UFC, Jose Johnson. And yep, another win, decision win for Azu Almabayev, and then he goes 3-0, gets to take on Mateusz Nikolai, and he cracks into the rankings 3-0 in the promotion. Number 14 versus number 7. And he's the underdog against the number 14 ranked minus 220 favorite. And there's a reason for that because another decision win for Almabayev, and that's what got him to face a former title challenger in Steve Erceg for the UFC Fight Night card. And unfortunately, Steve Erceg would be rebooked and have another opponent other than Almabayev. So then we try to do Almabayev versus Alan Nascimento. And Nascimento was unfortunately not the victim this time because Almabayev needed to reschedule. Because this is what happened. So after Almabayev's fight with Erceg gets canceled and then he's supposed to fight Nascimento, this fight, which was supposed to be the main event of the fight night in March 1st of Apex Center, and Brandon Royval versus Manel Comp at 2025, March 1st. And Royval had an injury, so Manel Comp needs an opponent. So what do? Azu Almabayev, who was ranked number 8, already fighting on the card. You scrap your opponent with Alan Nascimento and you get Manel Cup instead. And we all saw on his record how this fight ended. He was basically in a condition where he was outclassed. And I mean, look at him. He's running over the octagon, trying to sprint away from his opponent. And that was enough to stop this fight. So now we get to Almabayev versus Tamirov. And unfortunately, Ramazan Tamirov withdrew from this bout. It's supposed to be a highly featured bout on the Whitaker versus uh, De Ridder fight in Abu Dhabi, but other plans changed. So now we get Azu Amabayev versus Jose Ochoa. I believe this is like 2 months later. Good win for Azu Amabayev. Jose Ochoa is in the rankings himself as well in the new meta rankings. And then we get to Azu Amabayev's best win of his career against Alex Perez. Number 7 in the world against number 8 in the world. Very controversial. But good win for Almabayev because he submitted Alex Perez the same way he lost his only championship fight that he's fought in, short notice, mind you, against the former flyweight champion Davidson Figueroa by a standing, uh, flying guillotine choke, if you want to call it that. And now we get to the fight that was supposed to take place earlier this year at February 28th in Fight Night in Mexico City. Unfortunately, Almabayev had to pull out against his main event opponent, two-time flyweight champion Brandon Moreno. This would have been the biggest win in Almabayev's career. He wasn't able to make it, and unfortunately now he has a chance to take on Charles Energy Johnson. Now let's look at Energy real quickly. So he trains out of St. Charles Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu MMA Academy in St. Louis, Missouri. The pride of St. Louis is what he gets introduced as. And he also does some training at Tiger Muay Thai. Very nice. There he is right there in the middle with his bald head with the rat tail behind him. Also does some training at Murcielago MMA, which I believe is in Orlando, Florida. And yep, there he is right there with the group of the guys. I don't know if any of them are really like synonymous, but gets good buys, gets good work. So now let's look at his UFC record, 8-6. Certainly not his opponent's 6-1 record. He has just as many wins as his opponent has losses. That's hilarious. But now let's look more closely at this. But before we look at the UFC part, let's look at his pre-UFC days where he competed mainly in the LFA, where he fought former two-time title challenger, or one-time title challenger, my apologies, and top 5 ranked flyweight in the world currently, Brandon Royval. He would lose this fight via controversial decision, but he wouldn't return. Like this fight happened in 2018. He wouldn't fight for 2 years later. Finally fights for the vacant LFA flyweight champion against Yuma Horiguchi. Beat him in a 5-round split decision. Good win for Charles Energy Johnson to be the LFA champion. And then he would go in his first title defense. I guess this is the interim because somebody is the champion and they are getting signed to UFC, so that's weird. But Yao Camillo loses his fight, second round TKO, another good win for Charles Energy Johnson. And then he would go on to face Carlos Mota. And again, one of the best fights of the year in 2022 outside of the UFC. 5th round TKO, went all the championship rounds and then got finished before we saw the final horn. So now this is what got him the 3-time back-to-back-to-back victories in LFA for the flyweight championship. He would make his debut with an 11-2 record against a 10-year younger, undefeated Muhammad Mokaev, who was a minus 500 favorite, as he should have been. Your winner by unanimous decision after these two got into it in the weigh-ins, which this fight is taking place in Muhammad's backyard of London, England. And unfortunately, Charles Johnson has had his hands behind his back just like Jorge Masvidal would, but no cigar for you, Energy. But let's get to his last. We would do 5, but there is a fight so important in his 6th last bout, we had to include that in his top 5, or last 5, I should say, and that is against Joshua Van. Why this fight is important? I watched this fight live and in person, cage side, sitting next to the ringside physician doctors. Joshua Van fighting Charles Energy Johnson was piecing him up all 2 rounds, and I remember this. I watched it live, and then in the 3rd round, well, first Charles Johnson would get the victory, but in the 3rd round, 15 seconds into the 3rd round, he hits him with this like almost like chasing him uppercut. Like he didn't stand in the pocket. He was running towards him and just launched it to his opponent's chin and sent him to his back, staring at the lights, and got the victory over the current flyweight champion of the world, Joshua Van. After this fight, Van would go on a 6 fight win streak in like a year and a half and fight for the flyweight championship and win it and defend it 2 months ago back in May. So now, what did he do after he defeated the future flyweight champion? Sumu Darji, who is today a top 10 or top 15 flyweight, and he would defeat him by unanimous decision. And yeah, he is. Look at this, how messed up this is, that this is the meta rankings. Sumu Darji is ranked 12. Charles Johnson is 15, and he beat Sumu Darji less than 2 years ago. Continuing, Ramazan Tamirov, the man that, if you remember, was supposed to face Azio Almabayev, but he pulled out, fought Charles Johnson before that fight got announced, because this was back in 2024. And unfortunately for the number 12 ranked flyweight contender at the time, well, again, this was the fight that was supposed to happen, and it got canceled. And fortunately for Charles Johnson, he would lose. He thought he had this decision. He was so jumping up and down, and unfortunately, they gave it to Ramazan, and that stopped his win streak he was building that was capped off by defeating the future flyweight champion. But now let's get back to another more impressive victory. The undefeated flyweight prospect Lonnie Kavanaugh fighting in Shanghai, China against Charles Energy Johnson. He would be the minus 250 favorite. And Charles, I called this. I knew Charles Johnson was a live dog in this fight. Just like he did to the future flyweight champion Joshua Van, he got this victory underneath his belt by hitting him with this sick punch to the chin with the right hand, sent him on his back with half of it on the canvas and the other half on the cage. And to remind you, this man, just like Joshua Van, just like Sumo Jarjari, he is ranked number 5 in the top 5 of the meta rankings. And now we get to the card that would be the UFC debut on the Paramount era earlier this year, UFC 324. Featured prelim would be Alex Perez versus Charles Energy Johnson, number 11 versus number 13. Unfortunately for Charles Johnson, this would be one of Alex Perez's coming out parties that remind us why he's a former title challenger. He hit Charles Johnson with this left punch to the chin, sent his jaw shifting, and that was sending stumbling to the ground. And Jason Herzog says, I need to stop this. So now we get to his last bout that took place a few months ago in a fight night against Bruno Silva. And thankfully, it was a split decision victory for Charles Energy Johnson that did not allow him to be 3 out of his last 4 fights were losses. So he's 3-2 in his last 5 bouts, 4-2 if you include the 6, and that one includes the flyweight champion of the world. So that leads us to this weekend's featured bout on the main card of UFC Fight Night, Azerbaijan, Azio Almabayev versus Charles Johnson. I'm going with the energy himself, not just because I witnessed him defeat the future flyweight champion in my backyard with my own eyes, witnessing it, but it's also because he beat Sumu Darji, he beat Lonnie Kavanaugh, and yes, he beat Joshua Van. But we can't disregard Azu Amabayev and what he's done, because he beat Alex Perez. He guillotine choked him, no question about it. And we all remember earlier this year, Alex Perez faced Charles Johnson and sent him to his knees like a dog. Again, best wins other than that is against Ode Osborne. Again, that's a good win, but the reason why it's a better win for Azrael Mabayev is because Ode Osborne fought Charles Johnson early on in his UFC career. Split decision gave Ode Osborne the victory, and Charles Johnson just went over to the corner, shook hands with the Extreme Couture guys, Dewey in the corner there with his braided hair. But again, Sumu Darji, Lonnie Kavanaugh, Joshua Van, better body of work. I'm going with the dog again. Charles Energy Johnson. I think he beat Lonnie Kavanaugh and Joshua Van by knockout, but beat Sumu Darji by decision. I want to say it's going to be 3-round decision, just via hunch. Just a hunch. I think just like he beat Bruno Silva in his last fight, back-to-back decisions, and your winner, the Energy himself.